So we're continuing this series today, post-resurrection series called What Now? And kind of the idea with resurrection, at Easter, resurrection changes everything for sure, but it doesn't answer every question. And so that's what we're looking at, some of these post-resurrection scenes where folks are kind of left with, okay, what now? Or what's next? Or what do we do now? And the passage today is from John 21. If you can probably gather through the children's message. And I want to start there with Peter's encounter. This is the famous beach encounter with Jesus at the end of John. And famous, the "Do you love me?" 3-time scene. Are you familiar with this? Are you guys still with me? Yes? Anybody familiar with this? Yes. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So here we go. It'll be on the screen. I'm actually going to read it. It's a little bit long, but the story is really good, and I'm going to read it from the Message version today. So here we go. So after this is after. If you were with us last week, we talked about Thomas and Thomas putting his fingers in the side of Jesus and then coming to believe and what that was like. And so that's when it says after this, bless you, it's after that. So here we go. After this, Jesus appeared again to the disciples, and this time at the Tiberias Sea, the Sea of Galilee. And this is how he did it. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed Twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the brothers Zebedee and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter announced, I'm going fishing. And the rest of them replied, we're going with you. They went out and got into the boat. They caught nothing that night. When the sun came up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they did not recognize him. Jesus spoke to them, hey, good morning. Did you catch anything for breakfast? They answered, no. And he said, throw the net off the right side of the boat and see what happens. Well, they did what he said, and all of a sudden there were so many fish in it, they weren't strong enough to pull it in. Then the disciple that Jesus loved, I think I've shared this with you before, but when it says in the Gospel of John, this is the disciple Jesus loved, this is John referring to himself. So did that strike you as a little funny? It strikes me as funny. Anyway, that's another sermon, I think. But the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the master. And when Simon Peter realized that it was the master, he threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work, and dove into the sea. The other disciples came in by boat, for they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, pulling along the net full of fish. And when they got out of the boat, they saw a fire laid with fish and bread cooking on it. But Jesus said, well, bring some of the fish you've just caught. Simon Peter joined them and pulled the net to shore. 153 big fish. And even with all those fish, the net didn't rip. And then Jesus said, breakfast is ready. Not one of the disciples dared ask, who are you? Because they knew it was the master. Jesus then took the bread and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus had shown himself alive to the disciples since being raised from the dead. And then after breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Well, yes, Master, you know I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. He then asked a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Master, you know I love you. And Jesus said, shepherd my sheep. And then he said it a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Well, Peter was upset that he asked for a third time, do you love me? So he answered, Master, you know everything there is to know. You've got to know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. I'm telling you that the very truth now. When you were young, you dressed yourself and you went wherever you wished. But when you get old, you'll have to stretch out your hands while someone else dresses you and takes you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to hint at the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he commanded, follow me. That is a good story. Yes? And this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You know, I usually, if you know me, I usually don't wear clothing that has writing on it or funny little sayings or quips. You know, I don't usually wear clothing like that. I mean, occasionally, but usually I don't. But I do tend to notice when other people have clothes with writing on it. I figure that if people want their clothes to speak, then maybe I should listen. So sometimes when I'll see that, every once in a while, I'll say, like Mel, if you had a shirt that said something on it, I'd say, hey, tell me about that. One day a friend came up to me and she was wearing a sweatshirt, and that sweatshirt said, God is still writing your story. Stop trying to steal the pen. God is still writing your story. Stop trying to steal the pen. Anybody have clothing that says that? No? And I have to admit that got my attention. And so we talked about that. I think it got my attention because I know what it's like to trust that God is still writing my story. And at the very same time, feel a little bit unsure about how that story is going. You know what I'm saying? Especially after failure or regret or after moments that I wish I could rewrite. And I wonder if you know that feeling too. Anybody? Yeah. I guess we all reach for that pen from time to time, right? And I don't think we reach for that pen because we're necessarily controlling, although sometimes that may be part of it. I don't think it's necessarily about being controlling. I think we reach for the pen simply because we're human and because we're afraid. We're afraid. And it's a very human thing to be afraid that the story has gone too far off course. Maybe afraid that we have ruined something important. Afraid one moment, one decision, one betrayal somehow gets the final word about who we are. And that brings us to Peter. By the time we meet Peter in John chapter 21, the end of the gospel, the very end of the Gospel of John, the last story in the Gospel of John, Peter has already decided what kind of story this is now. He has already decided that this is a story about failure. Because that night, Jesus needed him most. What happened? Peter denied knowing him 3 times. And what happens now? Peter, in this moment, what's he going to do now? Well, as you heard, apparently Peter goes fishing, which is not a bad thing to do when you're trying to figure things out. But by now, Peter has actually seen Jesus, the risen Christ, I think twice, in fact, by my count. So this is the 3rd time, and still he goes back to fishing. And I love that John includes that little detail. I mean, what do you do when you don't know what to do with yourself anymore? What do you do when you don't know what to do with yourself anymore? Well, You go back to what's familiar. You go back to the routine, something you can control, especially after you have failed. You go back to what you know. And maybe that's where Peter is, especially after he has failed. He goes back to what he knows. I wonder if Peter is in the grip of his own shame at this point. This shame that says, okay, this is who you are now, Peter. That little voice in his head. Maybe you know that voice. This is who you are now. Failure. This is the moment that is going to define the rest of your life. You may try to run away, you may try to escape it, but it is always there controlling your life, this moment. So Peter goes backward, right? He goes back to the boats, back to the nets, back to the lake, back to what he knew before Jesus even called his name in the first place. He goes back. And honestly, I think that kind of fear has a way of finding its way into all of us. Maybe it's after a disappointment or after regret or after we have hurt someone or maybe even let ourselves down. We can easily fall into the trap of, like shrinking our future. We stop imagining that new life is possible, right? We assume that the story has now narrowed and this is all we'll ever be right now. And I think that's why this story in John chapter 21 matters so much. Resurrection has happened. Jesus is alive, but Peter is still haunted. And he can't get out of it. And then what unfolds on this shoreline, I think, is not just a story about forgiveness. It's the story about what Jesus does with people who think they have ruined everything. You know anybody like that? So think about this. I think it's interesting that it was on this same shoreline years earlier that Jesus first called Peter. And he called John, and he called James, and he called Andrew. On this shoreline, he said, "Come follow me," 3 years before. It was on this same lake that Jesus once told Peter, "Put out into the deep water." And Peter said, "Well, we've worked all night. We haven't caught a thing." But they went ahead and did it anyway, and they lowered their nets, and the catch was so enormous that the nets nearly broke apart. It was on this lake, this same lake, that Peter once stepped out of the boat and walked on water for a moment. Before, fear pulled him under. So much has happened here on this beach, on this lake, on this shoreline. It's where everything began for Peter. Everything. And now, somehow, it's where everything begins again. Full circle. So they just spend the night fishing. You heard the story. They caught nothing. They're just exhausted. It's daybreak. Jesus appears quietly on the shoreline. At first, they don't recognize him, which if you've been listening and part of this series for the last few weeks, you realize that that is becoming a theme in resurrection stories, that they don't recognize him, that Jesus keeps showing up looking, strangely ordinary, like a gardener or a stranger on the road or a man standing quietly on the beach at sunrise. That's how he's showing up. And when they finally reach the shore, they find something surprising, that Jesus has already made breakfast and it's waiting for them. Bread, you can smell it. The fish that is sizzling, and a charcoal fire. And that detail matters, because there is only one other charcoal fire mentioned in the Gospel of John. And do you know where that is? It's mentioned on the night that Peter denied Jesus, the night that fear took over, the night Peter stood around another firelight and said, I don't know him. Now here he is again, another charcoal fire, another morning, another chance to tell the truth. And I think Peter expects something here, at least internally. Maybe he expects some when Jesus pulls him aside and wants to have this one-on-one conversation with him. I wonder if he's expecting some kind of trial, or he is expecting some kind of an accounting for his actions, a reckoning. And what does he get instead? Breakfast. And that may be one of the most beautiful things in this whole gospel. Jesus does not come at him with accusation. He comes to him with welcome. He feeds them, sits with them, and then after breakfast, Jesus turns toward Peter and he says that famous phrase, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Not accusation, a question of love. 3 times, in fact. 3 opportunities to speak love where fear once spoke denial. And slowly, and I think gently, Jesus takes Peter back to the place of his failure. 3 denials, 3 questions of love. He's not trying to humiliate him, but Jesus is trying to recenter him in divine love. I think that's, maybe that's what healing is often about, right? It's healing is not pretending that the wound never happened. It's encountering love at the site of the wound where healing begins to occur. And by meeting Peter with love, Jesus does not try to reopen some trial, but what he does do is reopen the relationship. And with each question, do you love me? Peter has a memory of his denials. Do you love me? Yes, you know I love you. And then eventually Jesus says, feed my sheep. In other words, he's saying to Peter, Peter, you still have a future. You still matter. I'm calling you. This failure does not get the final word about who you are. And if you don't take anything else away from this message today, I want you to take that away with you. The failure does not get the final word about who you are. I think that's one of the hardest things about failure is how quickly it becomes personal for us, right? I mean, we stop talking about what happened and we start turning it into some kind of statement of identity about who we are. It's not, so it becomes not that I made a mistake, but it becomes I am the mistake. And shame has a lot of power to freeze people right there. You see it, I think, in Peter's life. Maybe you see it in the lives of people you know, or maybe in your own life. I've seen it in my life. At the moment of betrayal, at the moment of collapse, at the moment they disappointed, people disappoint the ones that they love. Some people will spend years standing emotionally beside old charcoal fires. And we replay conversations and regrets and even punish ourselves long after everyone else has moved on. You know what that's like? There are things you wish you could undo, wish you could take back, a relationship that's fractured, a season of your life that still aches in your gut when you think about it. And part of what hurts the most is not just what happened, but the fear that it says something final about who you are. that this is the truest thing about you. And I think this is exactly where resurrection becomes more personal than we actually or usually imagine. Easter reminds you, and it reminds me, it reminds all of us that faith is always the contest between the power of life and the power of death. It's always the contest between those two things. And the power of death isn't just about dying someday. The power of death is about all those forces that try to talk you and me out of our lives right now. All the forces that are trying to talk you out of your life, out of hope, out of courage, out of love. The voice that says, nothing's going to change, nothing new is possible, don't risk trusting anything or anyone again. And honestly, I think we know what that feels like, what that sounds like, what those voices are like. I think we know those voices very well. And my hunch is that Peter did too. And that's part of what drove him back to the boats, back to the nets, back to where it felt safe. But resurrection, what we see in this story, resurrection keeps pushing back again and again and again. Grace pushes back against the forces of death. Love pushes back. Life pushes back. Divine love of God continues to push back, always pushes back. Every time someone keeps showing up, every time someone keeps loving and forgiving and hoping and trusting, and even imperfectly, right? It doesn't even have to be perfect. Every time someone keeps showing up, the God of life is pushing against the closed doors of death and leaving them open for you and me to walk through. And this story says those voices don't get the final word after all. It says that your failure and my failure is not meaningless. It's just not ultimate. Are you still with me here? Let me kind of begin to close this out a little bit. And I want you to imagine that maybe you're on a beach today, okay? Metaphorically speaking. You're on a beach today, and maybe you're at a place where you've come face to face with yourself. A place where regret is washing ashore. When you're carrying things that you wish had gone differently. Maybe you're carrying a sense of shame that has convinced you that your story has gone small, that your best moments are gone, that trust is gone, that hope is out of reach. And then sometimes we start going backwards, so you feel like your life is going backward to old patterns or old fears or older versions of yourself because you no longer know what else to do. But imagine in all of that, imagine Jesus meets you there on that beach, your beach. And imagine he doesn't come at you with condemnation, but he comes to you with breakfast, with welcome, with another fire. And maybe around that fire, Jesus begins saying something shame never could. He calls your name and he says to you, you are more than your worst moment. He calls your name and he says, I am not done with you. He calls your name and he said, there is still love ahead of you. He calls your name and he says, there is still life for you. And then he calls your name and he says, follow me. Peter thought that story had ended, thought his story had ended at that fire of denial. And Jesus met him at another fire and it began again. And maybe today, I wonder if that's the invitation for you and me and all of us to believe that resurrection is not only about Jesus being alive again, but about discovering that failure does not get the final word about who you are. After all, right? God is still writing your story. And you don't have to try to steal the pen. Because your story is not over yet. What do you think? Laurel?